Disproportionality and Special Education. This is a presentation by myself, Diamond Imelda Williams, for the EDSP 875 course, Policy Issues Affecting Individuals with Disabilities, taught by Drs. Burke, Danahy, and Pagevaugh. What is disproportionality? Disproportionality in special education refers to three different areas of a disproportionate representation of a particular ethnic group and some type of disability category and placement and/or discipline. So 1, over-identification for special education is an area of interest. 2, educational placement, where these students end up once they've been identified as having a disability. And then finally, discipline, the disproportionate amount of disciplinary standards and methods used for students with disabilities. This debate presentation will not focus on discipline. It will focus only on disproportionality in special education. And this is actually in preparation and an outline for the policy paper that I wrote. Policy brief, excuse me. These are risk ratios. Now, risk ratios are basically a mathematic formula that basically demonstrates whether or not a group's representation in a certain disability category is proportional or not. Proportionality will be represented by the number 1. So you can see here with this graph of risk ratios for different ethnic groups from 2016 from the National Center for Learning Disabilities, there is evident disproportionality for overrepresentation and underrepresentation for various ethnic groups. This figure from the National Center for Educational Statistics also shows us that student diversity is rapidly increasing. However, teacher diversity is not. So you see on this graph, we have the blue squares and blue diamonds representing white teachers and white students, and we see that those numbers are steadily increasingly higher than those represented by Black teachers or Hispanic teachers. We also show that while there may not be an exact proportionality in terms of the rates of increase or decrease, we do see that Black teachers and Hispanic teachers, the rates of those teachers has been decreasing. However, the student population has been increasing in diversity. Now, this leads to and results in segregation. When we think about segregation, we think about the separation of Blacks and whites. This has been perpetuated by the segregation between students with disabilities and students without disabilities. This figure on the screen shows how students with disabilities who spend more than 80% of their day in the general education classroom. So this is also referred to as our least restrictive environment. One of the goals of some special education policy is to make sure that students are with their like-aged peers as much as possible. So if this graph shows us that when white students have a disability, they're more likely to spend time with their non-disabled peers. But when Black students are identified as having disability, they are still segregated more than their white peers. So why is this? We have to think about implicit bias and eugenics. So scholars, I put that in quotes for a reason, have used racist methodologies and epistemologies to perpetuate beliefs of inferiority based on racial and genetic factors. This is evident in educational literature and the language of our educators. The assessments and curricula are based on deficit thinking and a rigid formula of what constitutes intelligence, and these are all socially constructed. I didn't include here direct quotes from my research because I don't want to perpetuate the scream on Hester's scream, as Frederick Douglass has mentioned it, but there are some really ugly and nasty quotes that talk about the inherent uneducatableness of Black and brown students, about how our culture is just fundamentally not based in achieving educational standards or even believing that education is important to our community. And the question this leaves us with is, can you legislate out your biases? Can we make laws and policies that allow us, that mandate us to see and work beyond the limitations of our implicit biases? So when we look at the history, we run all the way back to the 14th Amendment, 1865. We know that all citizens have the right to equal protection under the law. This is where separate but equal is inherently unequal, right? This leads to that all citizens, Black, disabled, or LGBTQ, have the right to protection, and this also leads to IDA Part B. So we know that when this amendment was enacted, was ratified, that this did not mean that people were protected under the law. This did not mean that Black people, disabled people, or LGBTQ people had even an inkling of having rights. But in today's society, we have seen multiple examples of how this legislation has been used to argue for our fundamental constitutional rights as laid out in the Constitution. So this amendment is key to arguing for this legislation much, much later. We also get to IDA Part B, which specifically talks about disproportionality. It mandates that equal education is under the law. So Part B acknowledges and mandates that school systems address disproportionality when it comes to race and ethnic groups. This policy states that a state must use up to 15% of its funds for CEIS, which stands for Coordinated Early Intervening Services, if the state has determined through a statutorily required data collection that significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring with respect to the identification of children with disabilities and their placement in particular educational settings. These funds are to be used to serve the children in the LEA, particularly, but not exclusively, children in those identified groups. So there's a lot of things to dig out here. First, each state does identify disproportionality differently. That's something that will come up again later in this presentation. Moreover, these funds are dedicated for early intervening services, which begs the question, what about secondary? And also, when we have to use these funds to support these students, they're not mandated to exclusively use the funds. So we're not even sure how much funds are actually going to address this disproportionality. Again, what about secondary? Most recent legislation, and I will pause here so that you can read this slide, but basically this slide sums up some equity and IDA legislations that were tried to be enacted by the Obama administration. The Trump administration tried to stop that, and it took a ruling from the District of Columbia to mandate that the government did what it said it was supposed to do, and particularly the Education Department did what it said it was supposed to do, which was to address disproportionality in special education. But you can pause here to read the full summary of this legislation. More recent or current legislation notes that the prevailing technical rational paradigm, which prioritizes compliance and quantifiable outcomes, proves inadequate for addressing racial disparities in special education outcomes, a manifestation of a multi-layered systemic injustice. So this quote is cited below, but it basically comes from this paper, which talks about how we are not actually using the right mechanisms to address disproportionality from a policy level. This brings us to culturally relevant and sustaining education. How can we address these issues from a policy level? To the left, we have Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, the originator of culturally relevant pedagogy, and she comes after still other scholars who have cited their work, and she cited those giants she stands on in her work. But she brings us culturally relevant pedagogy, which brings us bridging academic skills and concepts with school culture and students' culture, cultural competence, so understanding who you are, the culture you come from, and also understanding other people's culture and where they come from. And then, of course, social political consciousness. And she says, if you're not doing all three, you're not doing CRP. And this is the step that a lot of teachers have trouble with because we're working to dismantle systems of power and oppression within our classroom, when often we are the representation of those systems of power. Then we have Django Paris, who gives us a loving critique of culturally sustaining pedagogy, which allows us to consider sustaining systems and to acknowledge multiculturalism and multilingualism in the classroom, and also to acknowledge that if the curriculum is broken, we really shouldn't be spending our time trying to bridge our students' culture to that curriculum to begin with. And so, looking ahead to policy that's forthcoming, I'm a graduate assistant for the Maryland Initiative for Literacy and Equity, or the MILE grant. And MILE is working with MSDE to implement a state secondary literacy policy. Currently, there are no recommendations or guidelines that include an equity framework or address disproportionality. This needs to change. So something that MILE uses to make sure that there's culturally relevant sustaining practices and the ways that they support the LEAs in Maryland is to ask teachers and school systems to use a historical literacies framework. This is from Dr. Gholdy Muhammad, and she cited this work in Cultivating Genius and Joy in Education Through Historical Responsive Literacy and Language Arts, also in her book, Cultivating Genius. So the elements of the historical literacies frameworks includes identity, who are we talking about, and who are the students in front of us, who's the teacher, skills, right? So we are still making sure that we are attending to the whatever measures of success the school system has set up, which usually involves some type of state test. What are the skills that are needed to demonstrate competence on these tests? Criticality and power. Are we examining and discussing the critical discourses of power that are engaged in the classroom and in our literature and in our educational school system? So intellectualism. What exactly is being taught? What stories are being shared, and how are students being asked to think and create about these stories? And then finally, joy, right? If there is no joy, then there is something broken in our educational system. And we believe and understand that within the Black educational experience, joy was a huge part of this process. This is why we fought and died and pursued an education at a level so passionately that we were willing to risk our lives, because there was joy and self-actualization in education. Some proposed solutions that I've come up with for this presentation. Not all of these followed through within my policy brief that I presented for the paper, but for this presentation I've presented, there needs to be some federal solutions at each level. Instead of mandating LEAs use 15% of their budget to address disproportionality, provide additional funds to help mitigate the gap, right? I'm citing Coe et al. In their 2025 paper, When Good Intentions Go Awry. At the state level, include CRSE frameworks within the literacy policies. These frameworks were included in the rubric that Mal used to examine all the LEAs throughout Maryland. So why aren't these included just in the regular state standards? And Mal is making it clear that this should be something that we look at, and the state seems to agree. However, it's not within policy. And then finally, at the federal, state, and local level, we need to increase incentives financially for people of color to enter the educational workforce. I know that some people think this is a radical idea. However, I strongly believe if you want to diversify the workforce, we need to compensate these educators proportionally for the work that they do. There are plenty of research articles that demonstrate the significant burden, the extra burden that is placed on people of color within these settings to serve our students to the best of our ability, and we should be compensated as such. And then on a personal level, Gholdy Muhammad mentions this in our text. Whenever our teachers seem to get stuck about, like, how do I serve these students and how do I connect? There's just a lack of love. If we would love better, we would know how to reach our students better. And finally, here's the Disproportionality and Special Education song. I will have this link below. It's much better to see full screen, and there's also an explanation video that explains the lyrics in more details. Thank you for listening. Fear not, shine bright. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.